There was a time not so long ago when technology in a law firm was considered a luxury, or a burden, depending on who you asked. Today it's the very fabric of the profession. What began with a public web in the 1990s has evolved into an ecosystem that now shapes nearly every aspect of legal work. I'm Jack Newton, and welcome back to Matters. Joining me today is someone who's been documenting that evolution all along, Bob Ambrogi, journalist, lawyer, and the founder of Law Sites. We spoke about the turning points that brought us here and what they signal for the future of legal work. Here's our conversation.
Hey Jack, you came all the way to Rockport. There's a great coffee shop right here. Let me buy you a coffee.
Thanks, let's do it. All right, Bob, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining me. And I'm thrilled to be in your backyard here in Rockport.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. As I said earlier, this is like the mountain coming to Muhammad. This is great. I'm so honored to have you come to my little town here.
Absolutely. Well, before we jump into talking about legal tech, I'd love to hear just a bit more about your story. What brought you here, Bob? You've been here, I think, for 30 years now. Tell me about your story. What brought you to Rockport?
I've come to this town, honestly, since I was a kid. My mother used to love to come here. And when I was in college and law school, we used to come up here a lot just on weekends, just for fun. And at some point, my wife and I said, why don't we just check it out? And we've been here ever since.
When you look at your job, Bob, as being a journalist, I think you're one of the most, if not the most important voices in legal technology. I affectionately refer to you sometimes as the Walt Mossberg of legal, but I'd love to hear more about your story and to have you share a bit more of your story, your trajectory, becoming one of the most important journalists in legal tech. You've been a journalist for, I think, the better part of 40 years now, and running your own blog for, I think, almost 25 now, going on, which is just an incredible run. Tell me about that story. What got you into journalism in the first place?
This year is officially my 30th year as a legal tech journalist, because the first published piece I can find dealing with specifically with legal tech was in 1995. So this has been 30 years, but my career starts, and you know this, but I was a journalist before I ever went to law school. I studied journalism as an undergrad. I worked at newspapers before I went to law school. I literally went to law school as a way of advancing my career in journalism, which a lot of people think is crazy. But in fact, there's a lot of similarities between practicing law and practicing journalism. It's all about gathering the facts and gathering the evidence and telling a story and trying to get to the truth. After law school, I kind of got sucked into practicing law a little bit, but made my way back into sort of mainstream legal journalism. I became the editor of a chain of legal newspapers that were based in the Boston area. And that was after I practiced law in the Virgin Islands for a while. That was a nice detour in my career. But I came back and I became the editor of paper there. I went to work for ALM in New York as a executive and an editor there. Really, in the early days of the internet, I just got really fascinated.
That was the late 90s, is that right?
Well, it was in 1993, 1994 was the year the web happened, the year the web became available to the public. I think the web was invented earlier, but it became available to the public that year. And so it was a year later that I actually published my first piece, because I was fascinated with the potential of the web to impact law practice. The very first column I wrote was about the web, was about lawyers are going to someday be using this for marketing. They're going to be using it for networking. They're going to be getting clients. They're going to be doing research online. I'll give myself credit for being somewhat prescient at the time.
Absolutely.
And that just got me fascinated. And I decided I'm going to just start writing about this, because nobody was paying attention to it. Very few lawyers were online in those days. There were a few. Greg Susskind, who's still around, was one of the early pioneers. And, people like that. Dennis Kennedy is still around, was an early pioneer, but not a lot of lawyers. So I kind of dove into writing about it, and one thing grew into another. I wrote a couple of books, and, 30 years later, here I am still doing it.
What was the initial draw to journalism?
I just like writing. I've always wanted to be a writer. I think my initial draw to journalism was more, I think I fancied myself becoming a novelist or something at some point, and that was what I would do to pay the bills until I became famous. But that part never happened. But I always liked writing and loved reading, writing everything
Yeah.
when I was a kid growing up.
You started your own blog, the Law Sites blog, over 22 years
Yeah,
ago.
it was 22. Yeah.
And what was the catalyst for that? And again, you were prescient, seeing the opportunity for the web,
Yeah.
to change everything. I mean, that was over a decade even before I started Clio. When you started a blog, you're also very, very early in launching a blog. What was the catalyst for founding Law Sites?
The catalyst for that was that I wrote a book about the web for lawyers. I then put out a second edition of the book about the web for lawyers, and probably no sooner did I put out the second edition that it was out of date because everything was
Things
changing
were changing
so
pretty
quickly at
quickly.
that point.
Absolutely.
And I just said, I don't think books are the way to write about
Right.
the evolution in legal technology. And so I started a blog simply as a way to keep people who had bought my book up to date on the latest developments in the area. And, that was the right move because books don't work in that fast changing environment. But, it's funny that even then the changes were nothing like what we're seeing now. There were many a week when I'd be scrambling for something to write about when there just wasn't that much happening.
Right.
And somebody would put up a new website and I might write about that because that was the biggest news. From then to now is just night and day in terms of the velocity and quantity of what's happening in this industry.
And you've got a very, I might even say unique perspective in that you're able to look back at really the better part of a quarter century's worth of technological change and advancement in legal. It is your feeling, it certainly does feel this way to me, that that rate of change is accelerating over the course of that 22 and a half years, or does it feel like it's been uneven in the advancements you've seen over that time period?
Oh no, it's been a steady and significant acceleration, especially in the last 15 years. When I started writing about legal tech, you could almost count on two hands the numbers of companies that were producing legal tech products. I mean, there wasn't a lot of development in this area. I mean,
Legal tech wasn't even really a space or
well,
a
I
term.
mean, this is the 40th year of ABA Tech Show this year, so there's been legal tech around for a while, but it was pretty limited in what it offered, and there really were just a handful of companies developing tech. Westlaw, Thomson Reuters, Lexis, were around then. A few others developing some early, time and billing and kind of early rudimentary practice management type platforms were certainly around, but nothing like today. So, the quantity of tech being developed is just exponentially changed since then. For me, kind of the most significant change, this applies not just to legal tech, but to tech of all kinds, is what I keep talking about, the sort of the Venn diagram of tech and law practice. And when I first started writing about this stuff, even when I was first practicing, they were hardly even concentric circles. There was law practice and there was tech.
Yeah.
And you didn't have to know anything about tech to practice law.
No. Yeah.
Nothing.
You didn't need a computer on your desk.
You didn't need nobody had computers in their desk. And a lot of lawyers still hand wrote motions or whatever and had a secretary
recording
type
on a dictaphone,
and they pulled books off shelf to do research or to find a referral. Martindale Hubble used to be these like books that line shelves that if you needed a lawyer in some other city, you pull down the book for that city and try and find somebody with an AV rating. So tech wasn't a thing. So gradually over these 30 years, those two circles have overlapped and overlapped and overlapped till we've finally gotten to this point today where there's no more periphery there.
Yeah.
You cannot practice law without technology. You cannot be proficient as a lawyer. You cannot be successful as a lawyer without fully embracing technology. So it's night and day in terms of what I've seen over the course of my career.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of framing it, I think. And when you think about what, is maybe attracting those two originally completely disconnected parts of the Venn diagram to a point now where, as you're pointing out, they're completely overlapping. What has changed? Is it lawyers' appetite for technology? Is it the value that the technology is delivering? There's this, prototype, maybe a stereotype of lawyers not wanting to adopt technology or being resistant to change. What do you think has changed over the last 25 years to drive that overlap of those two circles of the Venn diagram?
So I think part of it is simply just the changing world. I mean, it just in our daily lives in general, we've all adopted technology. The arrival of the mobile device. I mean, I always sometimes say the arrival of the mobile device is one of the most freeing moments for lawyers ever.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly they're untethered from their desks, so they can work anywhere. But I think with specific reference to legal practice, and I give you credit for this, I think the cloud, the advent of the cloud in the legal industry has been really significant.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't sort of a moment when that happened. But I do, and I've written about this because I do think that Clio's launch was, in a sense, a moment, because that was the beginning of the movement of practice management to the cloud. Before that, practice management software had been on premises, it had been clumsy, it had been difficult to maintain,
Mm-hmm.
it had been expensive. The advent of cloud software for legal practice changed all of that, made it easy to adopt it, made it easy to keep it current, made it easy to use it from anywhere. And I've really believed that the advent of the cloud was a major factor in changing the how lawyers use technology. The other one, we can't deny that the pandemic was really a pivotal moment where overnight, literally overnight,
Yeah.
lawyers went from lawyers who were reluctant to maybe use some of the more current technology tools, had no choice. They suddenly discovered the cloud, those who hadn't discovered the cloud. And I think I remember you and I talking like in 2019 or something. We were going to do a program somewhere where we put it, we were going to, on why lawyers should move to the cloud. We were still talking about that as of 2019.
Yeah, that's right.
And then
Is
suddenly,
the cloud safe?
yeah, having those conversations. And then suddenly 2020 came along, and that wasn't a conversation we needed to have anymore.
Yeah.
People got it right.
It did change overnight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think those were kind of the two biggest forces, that the cloud simplified technology, made it accessible, made it easy, and then that the pandemic came along and kind of forced everybody's hand who had been holdouts up until then.
When you look at what you've been doing over the last 30 years, it's really bridging lawyers to technology that might advantage them, help them gain some kind of edge, help them run their practice more efficiently. What have you seen change and evolve in lawyers' mindsets around technology? Like the pattern of adoption is undeniable, but is that the technology getting better and more compelling, or is it the mindset of lawyers shifting to where they're more ready to adopt technology, more ready to disrupt maybe the way they've been doing things traditionally? What have you seen on the lawyer side of the fence?
I think the biggest change on the lawyer side of the fence has been that they have become savvier about technology. As you know, I've written a lot about the duty of technology competence and the ethical rule that came along that kind of told lawyers, you need to understand.
Which is still relatively recent. Right?
Still,
in the last
2020, 2019.
Yeah,
2018. No, it's long, somewhere around there.
I
should remember
2019.
But yeah, it is still relatively recent. I think, again, I almost see this change happening a lot during the pandemic years, because suddenly lawyers went from feeling like they needed to have technology to becoming more critical consumers of technology and more critical thinkers about what they want technology to do for them or enable them to do for their clients. There's been a lot of focus in recent years on workflow, for example. I don't think in the early years of developing technology, people talked about workflow at all. That wasn't a thing. Talking about integration, again, that wasn't something that people really talked about. In automation. And I think lawyers have come to expect that technology is going to help them make their jobs easier and make them more efficient. And they demand more of it than they would have 10 years ago, even. So I think lawyers have become savvier consumers. I will say this is probably some people listening to this might think this is counterintuitive, but I've always there's this general mindset that lawyers have been slow to adopt technology and resistant to adopt technology, and I've always believed that in fact that's not entirely true. There have been some lawyers who have been slow, and right now in the current environment, there's a lot of focus on big law tech, on big corporate tech. A lot of big law firms have innovation departments of heads of innovation. But I actually thought that the greater drive, the greater savviness for tech adoption came out of the solo and small market early on.
Yeah.
And that the lawyers who were really driving tech adoption in the earlier years were those solo and small firms because they wanted a way to level the playing field.
Yeah.
And tech enabled them to do that.
Absolutely.
The big firms didn't have to worry about that. The smaller firms did have to worry about that. And so, again, I think that's one of the reasons why you guys were right place, right time, because there were a lot of lawyers who were wanting that technology, and you made it easy for them to do it. And not just you, but you guys happened to be first to the cloud, so no denying that.
I agree with you fully, by the way. I think when I looked at the legal technology landscape and looked at many of the products that were being offered to lawyers when I founded Clio with Ryan back in 2008, I really looked at those products and said, I don't blame lawyers for not adopting a lot of these products. They're pretty hard to use. Often, felt like almost interacting with a raw database interface. Like you had to be pretty sophisticated to use some of those products. And I don't think lawyers are unlike anyone else in that they just want to use really intuitive, easy to use products that make their day better and easier. And I haven't met a lawyer yet that rejects that kind of value proposition.
Yeah.
And I think as the technology has gotten better, I think we've seen a real sea change in the last 17 years since the advent of Clio and all the amazing products that have come onto the market in the interim that just make technology so much more accessible, so much more compelling, to a point where you're almost actively disadvantaging yourself if you're not embracing those products.
Yeah.
And I also look at the comment you made around solos and small firms. I think today, and for, again, I think more or less since the advent of the cloud, technology has actually been an opportunity for them to gain an asymmetric advantage over the big firms that move so slowly. And again, even when you look at some of the most rapid adoption of AI and impact of AI technologies, it's these solos and small firms that can move very quickly and be nimble and agile in adopting new technology and actually drive a real benefit and advantage for themselves over their big law counterparts. They can't move as quickly.
Right. Totally agree.
So you've witnessed now, the major chapters of technology development, a few major chapters in technology development over the last 25 years. You saw the advent of desktop and on-premise software, which, at the time was novel and replacing more mainframe oriented applications. You saw the advent of the cloud. You saw the advent of mobile and the transformative impact that mobile had. And more recently, of course, AI is a wave that I think is in a lot of ways dwarfing the impacts that some of those earlier transformative technology waves have had. I'd love to hear your perspective on AI, and we're just 2 years into that journey, maybe 3. But what is your perspective on AI? What are you seeing as some of the true profound impacts it's having on the practice? Are there areas that you believe are more hype than reality? Love to hear your perspective on that.
I think AI is without question going to be and is already starting to be transformative for law practice. The very nature of generative AI is language, is being able to effectively make sense of language and use words to create and to understand content. And that's exactly what lawyers do. I think generative AI is particularly well suited to legal practice as a profession. I think we're, still in the relatively early innings, early periods in a hockey game, I guess, but we're still early.
Now I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. You're from Canada. I had to say. But it's been interesting because, as you say, we're about 2 years into it, a little over 2 years into it. A year ago, I felt like a year ago at Legal Week, a lot of the developers, a lot of the vendors were still kind of talking about what they're going to be doing, what they're going to be building, how we're going to be using it. This year, I thought we started to see some more sophisticated products being shown and being, that have been developed, that have been released. And now we're kind of shifting more toward what's the next step. Using agentic AI, I think, is going to be kind of the big next step over the next year. We're going to be hearing a lot about that. It's sophisticated technology already. I think it's interesting to me also. It seems like it's opened up some new areas that have been really ripe for technological innovation that maybe haven't seen as much innovation before. Like, I'm thinking a lot about personal injury and litigation, where suddenly there are several tools that have come to market in the last year or so that are really focused on the deposition process, on drafting litigation documents, responding to litigation documents. E-discovery, of course, has always had sort of machine learning AI tools, but now in generative AI, it's opening up whole new ways to explore evidence and look for those smoking guns. It's already starting to be transformative, and as I say, we're early in it, so I think it's going to continue to be significant, especially over the next 5 years or so.
So let's next talk about the role of journalism in driving legal tech adoption, Bob. And your voice, as I mentioned earlier, is a really important voice in the legal tech community. Often, for a founder, and I remember in the early days of Clio, you wrote the very first blog post about Clio back in 2008, about these two crazy kids from Canada that you found in the back corner of ABA Tech Show almost 17 years ago to the day. I'd love to hear your perspective on, what being a journalist in legal tech looks like. And you write everything from product reviews to hard news stories about what's going on in the space, and have broken a number of important stories over your career. Tell us about that act of journalism and what it looks like.
Again, given that I came out of a background of having been a practicing lawyer, and then kind of I've had kind of in and out of journalism and law practice a couple of times in my life, and I still practice law part-time. I think I've always kind of seen my primary role as simply being a messenger, as simply being a reporter of what's happening and trying to help lawyers understand what's happening, why it matters to them, what the impact is on them, what the impact is on their clients, how it can change their practices. I think I've also kind of seen my role as, in a sense, a consumer advocate, in that I've tried to hold vendors to what they say, expose when they say something that may not be correct or true, and is in some cases even at least one famous case we were talking about earlier off camera, in which I exposed a legal tech CEO to have been a fraud and a thief who stole many hundreds of thousands of dollars from people.
Who's now in prison, I believe, right?
Who's now in prison on other charges. But it's the greater the velocity and quantity, the harder it is to keep up with it all. And I think something else interesting in terms of my own journalism background is that I don't have a tech background. I'm not a techie at all. I was a practicing lawyer who thought, gee, this stuff is interesting, and other lawyers are going to want to know about it. And I started diving into it. But to this day, I'm not a techie. And we were talking before about generative AI. Suddenly, I'm trying to learn about large language models and all about how does this technology work and what does it do. I'm still not sure I understand it, but I think I understand it better than a lot of people do. So there's that needing to try and translate things. I always thought one of the advantages I had as a journalist is I had to put things into terms that I understood in order to write about them for my audience, and that made it understandable by them as well. You know, I do this Friday podcast with a bunch of legal tech journalists, in which we sit around every Friday and kind of talk about things that are going on. And something we're all facing is just that, again, the velocity and the quantity of news that's happening. I mean, just today, I'm sure when I go back and check my email, I will have had 10 press releases of things being announced today. And it gets really hard to kind of decide, what are you going to cover, what's important to cover, and how are you going to cover it? Because there's a tendency to want to just kind of cover what's breaking, what's happening. But there's also the tendency to want to be able to dive deeper into things and be able to give our readers a better sense of whether they do what they say they're going to do, what their significance is. I've noticed that vendors in recent years are less willing to give you demos. Not give you demo. They'll give you a stage demo, but give you access
like
to
do a demo account, log
a demo
in,
account. Yeah,
kick the tires.
It used to be that it was routine that somebody coming out with a new product would say, here's a password for a month or something. Go in and play with that and write about it. They're reluctant to do that now. I don't know whether that's because they're not confident of their product, or if that's because they've just gotten savvier about PR and they want to control the messaging more. But it's changed, and it gets harder to really kind of get behind the claims that vendors are putting out there for their products. When generative AI, it gets even more so.
Yeah.
This people talk about, is this just a ChatGPT wrapper or whatever? It could be a ChatGPT wrapper, but it could still be a viable and strong product. But sometimes, again, it's hard to get in and actually try these things from my perspective. So I think my role has been evolving. It tries to keep up with, I try to keep up with what's happening in technology as best as I can. And sometimes that's a challenge. Sometimes it's real kind of spinning the wheels to keep up with everything at the pace that it's happening.
And what's your advice, as I mentioned, when you wrote that first blog post on Clio, this was the moment that made Clio. I think it really helped propel us from obscurity to eventually the success that we became over time.
But to bring the commission check, by the
way. But what is some of your advice? And a lot has changed obviously from 2008 to today. But I think back in 2008 we did give you a demo account and said, hey Bob, here's a live demo. Please go kick the tires yourselves. And I think we lucked out in that you read that email and checked out the product and thought it was novel enough to write about, because at that time it was the first.
I still have a Clio demo account.
Exactly. There's a commission, a working demo account for 17 years. But what is your advice to a founder today that is trying to stand out in the fray of, like you said, so much going on? You look back at the environment. Clio launched it in 2008, and we were one of a handful of interesting legal tech products to come to market in 2008. Now you look at the market map of just legal AI products, and it's dozens, if not now 100 plus companies in that space. How does a legal tech founder stand out from the fray in terms of getting attention from you or other legal tech journalists? What's on the do not do list? What's on the do list, just to increase your odds and hopefully make a positive impression?
The first thing is to have a good product. You talk a lot about product market fit, and it's surprising how many products come to market that don't ever develop. They've never thought about that concept. Often you see these products where somebody had a clever idea and they thought it would be a good product, but they never actually thought about whether there's an audience or what problem it solves. So I think number one is to make sure you've got a product that solves a real problem. But in terms of getting attention, it's tough for small startup founders now. I get emails all the time from people wanting me to cover them. And I like covering startups because I'm interested in that, and I try and do it when I as much as I can. Again, I think there's a couple of core. One is there are not that many people who write about legal tech. There are, there's myself, there's Joe Patrice and Steve Embry and Stephanie Wilkins and Nikki Black and a couple of other people out there. We're all approachable. I mean, email us. We like hearing from people. Getting out, going to shows and going to trade shows and just mingling with people. I mean, I've said this before, but one of the things I've credited you for and some other founders in legal tech is that in your early years and to this day, you are at these conferences talking to people. You're 100% approachable. You're having conversations with people. You're having conversations with customers, with users, with other developers. And I think that's really important. I think too many founders just don't know how to network, just don't know how to get out and make themselves known. And at Legal Week, at ABA Tech Show, and any of the other trade shows, you're going to see a lot of founders who are just there kind of doing their guerrilla marketing. They've got their logo T-shirt on. They're not exhibiting or anything else, but they're there and they're talking to people and making appointments and making themselves known. Reach out to people, write about tech, thought leadership of other kinds. I mean, a lot of people, LinkedIn right now is a great vehicle for thought leadership. And if you see somebody who is, if you're a developer or a founder and you've got ideas that are unique and worth sharing, just write or get up there and write about them and put them on LinkedIn or whatever else you want to do. Do a podcast.
I think your observation around approachability is exactly on point as well. I remember early days, I think at my first ABA Tech Show, going to Beer for Bloggers that Kevin O'Keefe was hosting, and you're there in a corner and I can walk up to you and share a beer with you and tell you a bit about this crazy Clio idea. And everybody who's anybody in that legal tech sphere of reporters, bloggers, is at one of ABA Tech Show or Legal Week. And I think down to a person is very approachable and welcoming of somebody that'll walk up to them and strike up a genuine conversation. I certainly found, I was an outsider to the legal industry when I started Clio in 2008 and found it to just be an incredibly welcoming and warm group of people.
Yeah. It's still somehow a small community, even as much as it's grown, but that sort of core community is still small and approachable, I think.
So I'd love to get your observations on, maybe a couple of the major trends. And you recently wrote a really fascinating series on the amount of private equity coming into legal tech, some of the roll-ups that are happening within legal tech, and maybe what is a harbinger of things to come, even with private equity coming into law firms over time with some of the deregulation we're seeing, at least in some states. What are some of your high-level thoughts on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing for the industry, and what kind of structure, what kind of investment structure will drive the kind of innovation that you think we need to see in the coming decade for legal tech?
Yeah, well, the series I wrote about that you talked about really kind of focused on practice management and small firm practice management, small to mid-sized firm practice management, and the fact that my sense is that a lot of legal professionals sort of don't understand how this landscape has evolved. When Clio started, 2008, you spawned a whole slew of copycats, essentially, with their own takes. Copycat, I don't mean that as a derogatory thing, but people understood that, the cloud makes sense, practice management in the cloud makes sense, and there's a lot of products, small independent
We can use
products.
copycats, that's fine.
Okay. But they, in recent years, really in the last, 8 to 10 years or so, pretty much most of the major practice management products out there have been kind of rolled up into just 6 major ownership groups right now, private equity groups for the most part. I think there's good and bad in that. I think the good is that some of these roll-ups potentially have more capital available for development and innovation, more money available for customer support, maybe better integration among like or related products. I fear that the bad side of it is less competition, and less competition therefore might mean less motivation to innovate. Less competition might mean higher prices ultimately for consumers. We haven't really seen that yet, and maybe we won't see that. In at least one of those major groups is on the market right now, very, very visibly on the market. I don't know what that's going to mean. I think there's good and bad to it. I think it's more a matter that I think as consumers, again, is part of the duty of technology competence. I think lawyers need to understand who owns what, who owns the technology they're using, what are the implications of that, how strong of a business is it, how viable of a business is it, what's its long-term perspective. I don't think it's necessarily sort of VC versus PE. PE gets a bad rap, I think, and I don't think that's necessarily proved out. But it's really more a matter of understanding who's really behind the company that you're working with, and what does that mean for the products that you're using.
And this is a nuanced thing, and it's not something that's necessarily jumping out at you when you look at a company's webpage. And maybe just for folks that aren't familiar with the term, when you say these private equity firms have rolled up a number of companies, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, they have acquired. There was companies that were formerly independent practice management platforms have been acquired and brought under the same ownership group. Many of them are still standalone as their brand, but they're all commonly owned now. They have common development teams, common customer support teams in some cases, common marketing teams. So they're all within a single business structure and freestanding brands. And in some cases, what you've seen is companies doing this in order to kind of acquire more legacy products that take a strong user base of a legacy product and maybe merge it with an up and coming cloud product to give a migration path to get from legacy to the cloud. In my article, I talked a lot about just sort of how certain key factors were driving this. The payments factor, for what I thought was really significant. As I've talked about for many years, LawPay was like the only game in town in terms of payments for lawyers. And then you guys started payment processing service. A number of other companies did. And it kind of got so each of these PE groups started building or acquiring their own payment service. That led to some changes along the way.
There can be an illusion of choice, right?
Yeah.
I guess in the sense that you might think there's 20 different practice management products in the market today,
right?
But ultimately there's a handful of companies that control and own those products,
right? And there's further the danger that of the handful of products those handful of companies own, they're going to concentrate a lot of their development efforts on one or two of those, not the full set of products that they have.
So some potentially get orphaned from a development or advancement perspective. Some might be sunset even, and customers force migrated onto a different product.
Right.
But I agree with your observation, though. For all of the consolidation that's happened to this point, it doesn't seem to have driven any really negative outcomes for consumers to this point. But I think the long-term risk is there's reduced choice and a few players that are really in control of the market.
I agree.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about where we are about to enjoy a beautiful sunset here in Rockport. But later this year in October, we'll be hosting our Clio Cloud conference right in your backyard here in Boston. You're one of a small handful of people that have attended every single ClioCon since the inaugural 2008 edition in Chicago. I'd love to hear your observations, Bob, just in seeing Clio and ClioCon grow from a germ of an idea back in 2008 to the conference today, and maybe just in more of a macro context. We've seen the number of conferences in legal really explode. Again, when we started Clio back in 2008, it felt to me like the only real technology-oriented conferences were legaltech New York at the time, and now Legal Week and an ABA tech show. But that whole landscape has really evolved. What are some of your observations on the trend lines happening there?
Yeah, no, Totally agree. I mean, I remember very vividly that first Clio conference. That conference was unlike any conference I had ever been to in my career. And because it was the first time I went to a conference that was more interested in innovating a law practice than in just presenting tools, technology tools for sale.
Right.
It was a whole different mindset. And it was what, 260 or something like that?
Yeah.
People the first year, I
Yeah,
think.
200 and change.
Something like that. But I just remember to this day so vividly how when I went to that conference, I thought I have just never experienced anything like this before. And I'm not just saying that because you're sitting here interviewing me. You know, I've written this, I've said this before publicly. Um, uh, I because for that very reason, I was always a little worried as it grew and grew and grew and got bigger and bigger because I was always afraid that it was going to lose the sense of community that made it special. But it hasn't. You guys have done a masterful job of building a much more significant conference, both in scale and size, without losing that sense of community. And I once, I don't know if I ever asked you how you felt about it, but I once wrote an article where I called it like almost like a cult-like
Right.
feeling, but it was
But the
as
best
I said,
kind of
the
cult.
cult of innovation, I think is what I said.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about your conference, as opposed to other conferences you go to, is that the people who go there because they are excited about changing law practice, and it's not just about can technology make me more efficient. It's really about changing technology in order to improve the delivery of legal services, in order to do a better job for their communities, for their clients, for society at large. It's the most excited group of people you can get together with at a conference. As you say, at the same time, it was at those days, there were like 2 other conferences people went to, and now you could go to a conference every week if you want to go to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing.
And there are a lot more legal tech conferences. A lot of some of them are really good. Some of them have, you know, in the same vein as ClioCon, really focus on innovation. There are a number of like big tech companies doing their user conferences now that have become a whole thing. So the conference scene has changed greatly, but I'm really excited about you guys coming to Boston.
Yeah, no, it's going to be a great city. Maybe as a longtime Bostonian, or at least Bostonian adjacent here in Rockport.
I lived in Boston for a while.
What are some of your tips for the must do's in Boston?
Oh, it's fun to just do there's the Freedom Trail, which is traces the sort of the historical route through the city of Boston, and that's fun to do. Just walk around. It's a great walking city. If the weather's nice, you can just walk all day, and it's a beautiful city. Walk through the Public Garden, walk through the Boston Common, walk over Beacon Hill, go over to Faneuil Hall, Quincy Market area. It's a great tourist town.
What teams are you rooting for? What are your favorite sports?
You'll be disappointed in me because I'm not a huge Bruins fan. I'm more a Celtics fan.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm if I can get to a Celtics game, I'm happy. Here's a little known fact for you that I don't know if you knew this about Boston, which is that did you know that Boston is where the billable hour was born?
I did not know that.
It was and what's even more surprising, there was a guy named Reginald Heber Smith, who was a Harvard Law School graduate who went to work at Hale and Dorr. But he became president of something called the Boston Legal Aid Society, which was one of the first legal aid agencies in the country. And as a matter of fact, he's credited with helping to start the whole legal aid movement. And he developed the billable hour not for Hale and Dorr, but as a way for trying to bring efficiency to this legal aid organization, because they had a lot of attorneys working, some volunteers, some getting paid from various charitable organizations. And he was trying to bring some business structure to the whole organization so they could make a better use of the money they had. And he came up with this idea of having them keep track of their time. And then he brought it over to Hale and Dorr, and the rest is history.
So we have him to thank for legal aid, but him to blame for the billable hour.
Yeah.
Well, that is a little known factoid and might make its way into my ClioCon keynote in October.
Yeah, you can verify that one. And of course, Hale and Dorr is now Wilmer Hale, and famous in the news right now for other reasons.
Right. So Bob, maybe looking ahead, when you think about the change that's yet to happen, we talked a little bit about AI and how we're still very early days in AI, but if you had some predictions to share around what the next 10 years look like? What do you think the face of legal tech will look like?
I think over the next 10 years, we're going to start to see, we're not going to start to see, we are going to see AI be embedded in virtually every aspect of law practice. It is going to be, you know, as inconspicuous as the cloud is now after all those years of fretting about the cloud. We don't think about the fact that we're in a cloud anymore. We're not going to be thinking about the fact that we're using AI in 10 years. And what that's going to mean for lawyers is that so many of the routine tasks that they do today, they won't be doing in 10 years. They're going to have more time to focus on all those reasons they went to law school in the first place, on thinking and strategizing, and doing the best they can for their clients. I think there's also going to be, I think we've been starting to see this already over the last couple of years, and you talk about this in your book, but much greater transparency for clients into what's happening in their matters. I think part of that's going to be enabled by AI, but I think clients are going to have a better understanding through more advanced client portals, through just better tracking, analytics, what's happening with their cases, where do they stand, better communications with clients. After having just talked about the billable hour, I'm thinking,
It's dead.
I'm thinking, it's certainly going to be a whole lot more AFAs, a whole lot less billable hour in 10 years. It just, I know we've been saying this, I've heard this since for as long as I've been a lawyer, that the billable hour is going to die. But it just doesn't make sense in the age of generative AI to keep thinking about tracking your time by the hour. That's not the way lawyers are going to be working over the next 10 years. Their time is going to be much more automated, and they're going to be spending much more time thinking rather than doing, and producing legal work in that way. And so I really think, I think 10 years we're going to see the fruits of everything we're talking about today in terms of law practice.
I've seen a lot of gnashing of teeth around,
Yeah.
what the impacts of AI will be as well.
Yeah.
In 10 years, does AI result in there being more or fewer lawyers practicing?
I don't think it's going to reduce the number of lawyers. I think it will only continue to expand the numbers of lawyers, only because the need for lawyers is not getting any smaller. The need for lawyers is continuing to grow. And one thing we haven't talked about here today, which I know we're both very much aware of, is the access to justice crisis in this country, and the fact that there are, significant percentages, 80 to 90% of people with legal problems in this country who are not getting help with those legal problems from a lawyer. They don't necessarily need a lawyer for all of those problems. There's no question that generative AI is going to make it possible to provide, to serve more of those people in different ways. There's going to be a lot more need for lawyers. There's going to be a lot more development of tools that are going to be able to, that will be able to help people address their legal problems without a lawyer. I think there's going to be, and it's inevitable that over the next 10 years, we're going to see a lot more deregulation or re-regulation in terms of how the laws regulate the practice of law in order to loosen things up so that technology can be used more fruitfully to deliver legal help to people. But the need for lawyers is only going to keep getting greater, even with technology.
Maybe moving on to my last two questions, Bob. You've got a really unique vantage point where you see, number one, the landscape of problems that lawyers have and understand those challenges innately, being a lawyer yourself, and you see the Cambrian explosion of startups in the legal tech world tackling various parts of that problem space. When you think about what some of the biggest opportunities are for maybe an aspiring legal tech founder today, are there unturned rocks that you think, why isn't anyone tackling this part of the opportunity? Or even if there are people tackling part of that opportunity, what would you identify as some of the highest opportunity areas of legal tech right now?
I do think that the justice tech area is one of those. And just to build on what I was just saying, I mean, there has not been significant investment into technology to serve the access to justice sector or the justice tech sector. There's this wonderful group, the Justice Technology Association, which kind of helps and mentors and brings together legal tech startups that are focused on justice tech. But I think there's huge opportunity there to do good and make money at doing good. We're starting to see more and more activity in that area, but I think that's going to continue to be one. I also just think, as I said earlier, I do feel like the litigation and personal injury space, setting aside e-discovery, has been underserved and underaddressed by legal technology. There's been classic sort of trial presentation software and e-discovery software, but these tasks around really understanding a case, telling the story of a case, getting through all the evidence and putting it together in some way are really ripe for development right now, I think. So those are probably the two that would jump out at me right now.
And both application areas that are so ripe for Gen AI having impact there as well. And just to use one example in the justice tech space, when you talk about that 80 or 90% of people that don't have their legal issue resolved by a lawyer, a big chunk of that 80 or 90% are people that don't even recognize they have a legal problem.
Right.
And I think about just the massive opportunity there is for, a conversational interface with generative AI to help you understand, hey, I'm a tenant being evicted from my apartment. What are my rights? Let me understand your jurisdiction here, your rights. I can route you to a lawyer that helps you defend your rights. There's so much opportunity in that space, and it seems uniquely well suited to AI.
Right, and to do it conversationally in a language that the consumer understands,
accessible to them.
It's accessible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And finally, my last question, in the same vein, what do you see as the biggest challenge for legal tech companies over the coming handful of years?
The challenge is what we talked about before, which is getting noticed. There's such a glut of companies coming to market, such a glut of products coming to market, that it's difficult to stand out and get heard amid all the din. And also, just to kind of go back to what I said before, part of the challenge is just coming up with that product that really is unique and that really does address a real problem or need in the market. I see a lot of copycat products coming out that don't necessarily distinguish themselves in any way. I think you need to be able to distinguish yourself. We talked early on about the fact that I've been doing this for 30 years, and one of the problems with that for some of the companies I write about is that I have institutional memory, and sometimes it's been a number of times when a company comes to me and says, "We have the first product ever to do this," and I have to be the one to tell them, "No, you don't have the first product. Somebody tried it and failed miserably," and that's happened any number of times. So. But yeah, just getting noticed, getting heard is a real challenge. And getting those first paying customers.
But to your point earlier, get that product market fit, have a great product, and a lot of the rest takes care of itself.
Yeah, and apply for Startup Alley at ABA Tech Show.
Well, Bob, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed, again, getting to get on the other side of the microphone and find out more about you and your background and your amazing story. I want to thank you for everything you've done for legal tech and helped really shine a spotlight on so many companies and help drive adoption of legal tech and help be an advocate for the space. So thank you for everything you do for both lawyers and companies alike to help bridge that gap.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm really honored that you've come to my little town here.
Thanks for having me.
It's a little off the beaten path.
What a stunning place.
It's been a real honor, and I appreciate everything you've done for the legal world as well. So it's been a great pleasure to have this conversation and many more.
Well, thank you. One of my biggest takeaways from Bob today was his perspective on the Venn diagram of law practice. As he pointed out, there's no longer a periphery. You simply cannot be a proficient or successful lawyer today without fully embracing technology. If you've enjoyed this episode of Matters, please subscribe wherever you listen to your shows. I'm Jack Newton, and thanks for listening to Matters.